Okay, so I'm delighted to welcome Kathryn Broome, the winner of CPCAB's Counselling Research Award, to our head office in Somerset. So you're here to discuss your research. Would you like to start by telling me the title of your paper, please?
Yes, certainly, and thank you for having me. It's a great honour. The title of my paper was How Do Counsellors Make Sense of the Online Disinhibition Effect when Counselling Clients via Video Conferencing? And it was an IPA study.
I'm aware that this is an area that really hasn't been widely researched. So what brought you to the point that you were inspired to explore the online disinhibition effect within video conferencing therapy?
I think for me, there were kind of three strands that were going on pretty simultaneously during COVID. So first of all, I'm a counsellor. So during COVID, I was offering therapy via video conferencing, noticing kind of how different it was, working out kind of why do I feel different, what's going on, noticing how my clients were responding. So there was that area. The second area was the fact that I'm also a lecturer and a trainer, so I was delivering and writing some of the courses for video conferencing therapy, as well as learning from them as a counsellor. And then the third strand was, as a client. At that time, I was having my own personal therapy, and we were moved very abruptly onto video conferencing. And I remember how different that felt for me as a client. And I was trying to understand, why does this feel different for me? How at some points can I feel very, very inhibited and not want to say anything, whilst at other points, I feel almost protected by the screen and I can say a little bit more. There was a process going on for me as a client. So all of those things kind of came together, and then I started reading more about online disinhibition and discovered that there really wasn't a lot out there at the time in terms of current literature. I was also studying my MRes, my Masters in Research, and obviously looking for a research topic. So the two came together really, really nicely for me. And then I started looking around at the literature, and what I found was that, first of all, when we looked at video conferencing therapy, there wasn't a lot on video conferencing therapy on its own. It tended to get lumped together with other forms of online delivery. So it'd be put together with email counselling, text counselling, also with telephone counselling at some points in time. So there was a real lack of research looking at video conferencing. And then when I looked in the counselling literature at that time, there was a lack of exploration of the online disinhibition effect within counselling. But when I checked out the computing and behavioural sciences journals, there was a lot in there. The focus, it was surprising. I remember, because I couldn't find anything, I searched the databases. Actually got a librarian to check with me, why aren't I finding anything here? It must be me. It wasn't. There really wasn't a lot around at that time. But if we look at computing and behavioural sciences, there was lots in there. But this really focused on cyber aggression and looking at what we'd call toxic disinhibition within cyber aggression. So, and the focus at that point was adolescents and perhaps text and blogs, websites, that sort of on social media. So it's probably helpful really to think about how we define online disinhibition as well. So,
how do we define online disinhibition when we're referring specifically to video conferencing therapy?
Sure. So the definition is fairly broad. It's not specific for video conferencing, but really it's kind of a loosening of those psychological restraints. And it's a way of explaining how we might behave differently when we're online to what we do face to face. So, in everyday life, we probably see it quite a lot. We see people behaving differently on social media, perhaps saying things they wouldn't say if they were face to face. Perhaps being more forthright or opinionated, or, sometimes, saying quite hurtful things on there that they wouldn't do face to face. So we think about everyday life, there's disinhibition around that we notice, but thinking about, how does that then translate into the counselling arena?
Yes. And thinking about how it translates into the counselling arena, I experienced myself that sudden jolt into working online, both, working with clients, being supervised, teaching online within a matter of days.
Yeah.
And I got the sense that a lot of us were feeling very at sea with this.
Sure.
And at the time, there were trainings available that focused very much on client disinhibition and how to manage the boundaries. But I think what struck me about your research is that you explored how counsellors may experience online disinhibition. So can you explain your rationale for that, please?
Yeah, I think it's exactly what you've just said. There was very much a focus at that time on disinhibition is something that happens to the client. It's a behaviour that we might notice in the client, and the focus very much being on picking this up in the client and managing it. And it puzzled me. It really puzzled me, because I was thinking, well, we have these, what we call mediating factors. So we've got, Sula describes certain things that play into this disinhibition effect. So we've got that sense of distance, the fact that, we're in little boxes if you're on video conferencing. So there's kind of partial invisibility. There's a sense of things being real but not real, perhaps a protective element of the screen. Lots of things are playing in. And I was so puzzled, because I was thinking, well, okay, so this is happening for the client, as the client's there. Surely the counsellor is experiencing exactly the same things on their end, and somehow their client and counsellor are meeting in the middle in this kind of online space. It just stood to reason that both were going to be potentially impacted by some of these factors. So, yeah, I thought we really need to find out more, because yes, there's a gap there, but the inference of that gap, or what that gap means, is that we don't understand counsellor process. We don't understand how, if at all, this may play into the whole counselling process. How does it potentially affect the relationship? It was a real black hole, if you like. There was just nothing there.
Yes, because and with hindsight, it felt like the counsellor was actually being forgotten in the relationship.
Sure.
And there was something about the client, the work being mediated by or through a screen, but then what was on the other side of that screen. And it's that you explored.
Yeah, absolutely. And how what was on that side of the screen with the counsellor then could potentially impact the way the client experiences the counsellor as well. It's a two-way sort of co-created relationship. That was the rationale.
So it would be good now to look at your research in more detail. So firstly, I'm really interested to understand, more about the design of the study, and particularly why you actually carried out a pilot study initially.
Yes. I chose a qualitative design because I was really interested in participants' experiences. A lot of the research pre-COVID had been quantitative and really concentrated on the efficacy of video conferencing and symptom reduction.
Okay.
During COVID, more was coming through. So online disinhibition was starting to be mentioned, but not explored. So I chose an IPA study, really so I could explore how counsellors experience this, if they do, and, what sense do they make of that? And that was why I went for an IPA, because, it's got an ideographic and a phenomenological underpinning.
Yeah.
So a really detailed examination of each participant's experience, and then being able to appreciate that each participant will experience what they're experiencing in their own unique way. So that was my choice for the design of the study.
Yeah.
And I followed Smith, Flowers and Lark in 2022, so it was their updated version of IPA. And while you were talking about, why did I do a pilot study?
Yeah.
There were great learnings that came from that pilot study that really informed my research. So for me, it was an essential part to gain a greater understanding of the actual research.
Okay.
I think I'd recommend it for all research if you could, because what I did in the pilot study was I designed the questions of my semi-structured interview in collaboration with other therapists, because I really wanted this to be relevant to practice. I am a therapist, I'm a trainer, a lecturer, but, this is my perspective. I wanted to talk to other therapists and just say, okay, what are you interested in? What would you ask? What are these questions like? So I designed the questions alongside other therapists. And also some input from BACP as well, to really make sure that I'd be asking the right or the most helpful questions.
Yeah, so it was a really collaborative process before you even started this particular research.
Yeah.
It sounds really valuable.
Oh, it certainly was. I think my research would have looked very different without the pilot study. And the other thing I learned from it that I didn't expect to learn from it was how difficult it was to get participants for this topic.
Okay.
Because a lot of people were saying, well, it's just not relevant to me. This is a client thing. It's not something that I am experiencing.
Okay, so it wasn't something that wasn't relevant because they weren't using video conferencing technology. It's that they were using it. They were doing video conferencing therapy. Sure. But actually felt that, as we said earlier, the issue lies with the client. There's no therapist involvement in this relationship.
Yeah, it was very much therapists didn't feel that, they were involved or they had anything useful to bring. Okay. There was a lack of awareness that you're actually experiencing the same conditions as your client is experiencing in your own way. And I also wondered whether there was, because there'd been a focus on how we manage client disinhibition, whether it was perhaps felt unprofessional to perhaps acknowledge or even think that as a professional we might be reacting to some of these factors in a way that might lead to online disinhibition. So it was tricky getting participants. Yeah.
But you did recruit 6.
I did. I got 6, yes.
What is interesting to me is that I noted that only 2 of the 6 opted for an in-person interview.
Sure.
And the other 4 chose video conferencing. So do you think that's significant? And if so, in what way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I very deliberately wrote that into the design of the research, because I felt that whatever the participants' response was to their choice, that would give me an understanding of how they experienced the medium and what sense they made of it. So my first question was, you chose this medium, either face-to-face or video conferencing. Can you tell me a little bit more about your choice? What was your rationale? So yes, what I found was that if the participants were comfortable with video conferencing, then they would choose it for convenience, for time efficiency. This fits nicely into my diary. There's no traveling. There's no cost. So it was very much if somebody felt comfortable on there, it was very much a functional medium. A couple of the participants said they would have preferred face-to-face, but chose video conferencing because the convenience actually was more important. So even when faced with, which do I prefer, the convenience aspect would trump, if you like. That would be viewed as most important. Yeah. And a couple of the participants that chose face-to-face did so because they found it more relational. They found it more personal. They wanted to interact with a real person. So again, that told me a lot about how they viewed being face to face and how they viewed video conferencing. And it's interesting. One of the participants had mentioned about how sometimes when you're online or video conferencing, it's quite difficult to slow down.
Okay.
That there's a little bit of lack of regulation. Things just kind of race away a little bit. So again, yes, all relevant, all, really good pointers towards the topic I was exploring.
Definitely. That in itself sounds as though it was an important part of the whole process.
Sure.
So thinking about the themes that emerged from the interviews you did, there are 3 group experiential themes, so those overarching themes. It would be really helpful to just look at those in more detail. So firstly, I think the first theme you identified was the phenomenology of disinhibition.
Yeah.
So do you want to unpick that for us a bit?
Yes, certainly. I think before we go through each theme, it was kind of like a overview of the findings, was that just how personal participants' experiences was of online disinhibition and those mediating factors, and how they'd make sense of it through their own personal experiences. And that when talking about being disinhibited or disinhibition, that was always understood in relation to being inhibited.
Right. Okay.
A lot of time people would be talking about inhibition as well as disinhibition. It was a continuum that people kind of moved along, if you like. And throughout the research, there was very much an understanding of online disinhibition as a response to changing to the technology, adapting to that technology during COVID, and how the technology had affected, their experience of the relationship. So there were three themes, the group level themes. And the first one, yes, phenomenology of disinhibition. Again, quite a mouthful. And, what I was exploring with the participants was, what's your personal experience of being disinhibited? So it's, thinking much more broadly than just via video conferencing, and life in general.
Yeah.
Tell me about times when perhaps you might have felt disinhibited. And the results were really interesting. It really depended whether somebody was talking about online or face to face. So if we talked about phenomenology of being disinhibited in person, participants talked about feeling free, about feeling at ease, having fun, joyful. There was a real playful aspect to this. I'm smiling at the same time. It was a real fun experience. If we talked about perhaps being disinhibited online, that was seen as much more uncomfortable, embarrassing, cringy. It was a really embarrassing experience.
Yeah, and I picked up from your paper that some participants even felt shame at having been disinhibited or feeling disinhibited online.
Yeah, absolutely. So most participants, whether it was face-to-face or online, felt some retrospective shame. They're kind of oh gosh, was I a bit too much? Should I have done that? There really was a feeling of shame that came through for most participants. And then there was also a difference in the way participants made sense of their experience.
Okay. Yeah.
And again, that depended whether we were face to face or online. So face to face participants were talking very much about, if I'm disinhibited with you face to face, that's because I feel safe in the relationship. I feel free from judgment. I feel safe. I can be free. I can be myself. I don't have to edit myself. I can be me. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So a lack of inhibition. Yeah. When we were talking about noticing the same things online, or how they'd experienced it online, it just came up with a lot of questions. There was a real struggle to understand or make sense. And the focus immediately went to what we would perhaps think of as toxic disinhibition that Sula said is a kind of an outpouring of hate or anger. So participants really struggled to make sense of that. You know, is there something wrong with people? Is it a personality disorder? Is it, do you just do it because you can? Real puzzlement and distaste, I think, with trying to make sense of it online. So, yeah, there were a lot of really valuable findings just from that first part of the research.
Yeah, which it seems to me that was aimed at just getting a sense of how the participants understood what inhibition, disinhibition is. That would then, I suppose, lead to then a consideration, say, of how it impacts the therapeutic relationship. Sure. But also, if we're thinking about the second group experiential theme, actually having to adapt to technology in the post-COVID world, and how this is here to stay now. It's not going away. We're not going to go back to a primarily face-to-face kind of world of work now.
Yeah, absolutely. And this came through really strongly in the participants' responses. There was only one participant who had used video conferencing before. For the other participants, it was very much like you said at the beginning, you know, a feeling of being forced into this. There was something that we had to do very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And understanding the factors of disinhibition or how we are was played out against that backdrop of needing to adapt to the technology during COVID and also post-COVID, because my research took place, you know, sort of 4 years after COVID. Yeah. So I think I had the advantage of being able to talk to participants about their experience during COVID, but also there'd been a good few years since for the general anxiety that was there to settle down and for people to become more accustomed to this way of working. But yes, within that group experiential theme, there were a couple of subgroup themes. And the one that came through really strongly was, you know, it's effortful and it's weird. The word weird came up so many times, and effort.
Yeah.
So there was the effort of accommodating practicalities, and that's been mentioned a lot of times in different papers, you know, the thought of having to set up your own confidential space, how you manage the boundaries, how you actually deal with the technology as well. Yeah. So there were practical aspects, and that wasn't a surprise. But the effort that was involved in resolving what the participants called a sense of dissonance. So really resolving this sense of we're apart, yet I'm trying to fool myself that we're together. So I know we're apart, and yet in this moment when we're working, I feel like we're together. So there was this tension, a real sense of dissonance, and it was an effort to do that. And, you know, it's written in the literature, and also some participants described the feeling that after a while their perception of reality changed. So whilst they knew they were separate from the client, as sessions progressed, they would actually believe that they were together.
Do you think that is because, you know, the relationship was developing, so maybe it was easier to feel that connection? But there's also something about that space in between the therapist and the client, and the therapist was finding a way of creating that kind of, you know, if they were kind of finding some way of mentally creating that therapeutic space.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was part of that involved. It's also mentioned as one of the mediating factors of disinhibition by Sula, that kind of dissociative imagination that we actually start to believe something that we know isn't true, but in the moment we can start to believe that. For some clients, this process happened more naturally than others. For some, it was a sense of dissonance that couldn't be resolved, that it actually got in the way, that, conversing with a screen rather than a person. So you're actually conversing with a representation of a person. That, for some participants, was too difficult to resolve. But there was a real effort there of trying to resolve the sense of things being real but not real. And, the impact of that technology. So for some participants, the technology, as you said about creating that online space, the technology became integrated into the relationship and inseparable from the relationship and informed the relationship. And for some participants, they could use some of the functions. We can have the camera off, we can turn it on, we can do different things. It was much easier to accommodate factors of the medium.
Yeah.
And this was seen as a helpful process. But, not very much thought was given to actually what's going on beneath that. How are we making sense of this? How's the client perhaps making sense of this? How are you as a counsellor making sense of when your client turns the camera off or doesn't, or, moves away from the screen or does something else at the same time, a different task. So there was very much, participants discussing factors or the mediating factors of online disinhibition without really being able to attribute it directly to that. So yeah, it was so fascinating, and it all went back to a very individualized sense of making, of understanding what was going on.
Yes, I think you're right. It's absolutely fascinating. And I think it seems to me that what underpins all of this is what's happening in the relationship.
Sure.
And that, of course, is your third theme, the therapeutic relationship via video conferencing. So is there anything you'd really like to expand on with regard to that?
Yeah,
it's a huge area.
Yeah, it was a huge point. The fact that the video conferencing relationship is co-created, that and informed by and inseparable from the technology, and also I think just when we look at kind of the impact of the technology. And also then the context. I think there were the two sub-themes that came through. There was the impact. So the impact for most participants was that, it's actually harder to perhaps build the relationship at the start. There needed to be more attention to trying to make contact with this image on a screen, and a sort of a sense of surprise of, you are actually real, the other side. And for a lot of participants, the relationship could be developed, was strong. It was a helpful therapeutic relationship, but not for all participants. For some, that sense of dissonance, that the technologies got in the way. There was no way of resolving that for some participants. I think one of the key points that came through was just how different the boundaries might look during video conferencing, and viewing perhaps this as a co-created endeavour. Yeah. So clients would do what they could do because they were in their own home. So there was, we talk of clients perhaps tidying up or doing different tasks. And the tension that the therapist held on, do I go with it? Or can I roll with it? Is it okay? Yeah, there was so much from quite a few participants. Tension there and worry that they were perhaps being unethical or not holding the boundaries like they suppose they should have been, but could also see how helpful that might be to the client, because the client was not being as inhibited as perhaps they were, not editing themselves as much. So they were they were sharing more. So this felt helpful. So the real tension there. But for another participant who said, well, but actually that's the work, isn't it? The work is the struggle.
Yeah.
The work is the struggle. How do I share with you? How can I be with you in relationship? That is the struggle. And if we just take that away, then you've devalued the work.
Again, I come back to this word fascinating, but also so relevant for our work.
Sure.
And, you know, the findings you've been speaking of really speak to me of my experience of video conferencing therapy. And, you know, we know that research is so important for qualified counsellors to continue developing and learning. And I think it's also important for us to understand that research is a living thing. It's something that feeds into the work we do. But I think I'd also like to highlight that it's very important for trainee counsellors to start engaging with research, you know, as early in their counselling journey as possible. So what would you say to trainees about how research can help them develop and also impact their work with clients? This research in particular, but research in general as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm absolutely passionate about research informing practice, and especially for trainees. But I think all therapists, whether they're a trainee or an experienced counsellor, you know, it's beneficial to engage with research. We should always be, you know, challenging ourselves and refining and developing our practice. But I think for trainees, yes, there's an increased focus and attention to learning at that point.
Yeah.
But I also think, as well as, you know, trainees becoming more used to engaging with research, so there's a responsibility there for, you know, trainers such as myself to be incorporating research into teaching, so that trainees become used to critiquing research, not just taking it at face value, really pulling it apart.
Yeah.
You know, there can be a fear amongst some trainees about not being able to understand it. About, you know, but really being able to critique it. And there's also responsibility, I think, for myself as a researcher and for other researchers to actually perform research that is relevant to practice.
Yeah.
That there is a direct relevance to practice, you know. So you've done this research, kind of, well, so what? You know, how does that help? But also to write it in a way that's accessible.
Yeah, and that tells people why it's relevant.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's easily understandable why this research is so important.
Absolutely. So research can be robust, it can be credible, it can be trustworthy, and it can be easy to understand, and it should be easy to understand. And we talk about my particular research with video conferencing, you know, the increased use of video conferencing now, you know, it's been there for a while, but obviously became much more popular during COVID. I think nearly all of counselling was held via video conferencing because it was perceived as being, I guess, the closest we could get to face. But, you know, post-pandemic, it's estimated that eventually that'll settle at around a third.
Yes.
So it is hugely relevant that we look at research, and for trainees to be able to engage.
And that does demonstrate, you know, the figures you've just said demonstrate why your research is so important, and, you know, the implications that it could have for the future of video conferencing therapy. So I suppose, how can tutors and learners understand and explore this and really allow it to inform their client work, or understand how it can inform their client work?
Sure, yeah. So there were quite a few implications, recommendations that came out of this research. I think the main one that underpinned everything else was the need for deep reflection. So whilst talking to the participants, they realised so much more about their practice when they were reflecting during the questions. This wasn't something that they'd thought about before. You know, they would often think about or realise with surprise, maybe in supervision, that was a lot for 2 sessions. But it was, disinhibition wasn't very often named or thought about. The mediating factors weren't discussed or thought about. So the need for deep reflection, both of how as counsellors we might feel disinhibited, not just via video conferencing, but in life in general, how we make sense of that actually informs how we make sense of this when we're online as well. So it was the deep reflection part that really came through, and to view online disinhibition as a co-created endeavour. This isn't something that happens to either party in isolation. Both counsellor and client are experiencing the same mediating factors. They're both experiencing the distance, the slight time delay, the invisibility, the protection of the screen. They're both experiencing this, and it's a co-created endeavour. So let's explore it together. Yeah, let's explore what's going on, for the counsellor to do their own reflections on what's going on for them, but then to be able to bring that more into the room with the client, or into the online space with the client, yes, rather than the room.
Yes, so it can enhance and inform the work. It becomes a part of the work itself.
Absolutely, because it's there.
Yes.
It's there implicitly. And it was only on deep reflection that, some of the participants started thinking about, actually, sometimes I'm a bit too comfortable when I'm at home, and I can sort of sit back a bit too much. Well, how does that then impact my practice?
Yeah.
Or, I get ready up to a point in the morning, so I look perfectly like a counsellor here, but I've probably got my pyjamas on and my slippers. I haven't really thought about how does that actually play into me as a counsellor and what I'm offering? How does that inform my presence?
Yes. So it sounds as though kind of that deep reflection, that recommendation from your paper is a particular finding that you feel is very relevant for our work and could possibly be researched in more detail.
Absolutely, and that's emphasised in training courses, also within supervision. I think for supervisors to be aware of how much this deep reflection and pausing can be so valuable in our understanding and experience of that dynamic.
So actually, for a space to be provided in supervision to reflect deeply on the work, not just, in face-to-face work, as has always been the case, but a really specific focus on video conferencing therapy and the impact that it has on the work.
Yeah, absolutely. That came through so strongly, and all of the participants were saying, I'd not thought about that, but that's really interesting. I'm going to go away and I'm going to explore that further. So for space to be made, not only within supervision, within the training courses, to really emphasise it. Reflection is always part of our work, but I think there's a specific focus here that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's come across so strongly from the conversation that we've just had. So as we come to the end of our conversation, is there anything else that you would like to add that you feel we haven't covered yet?
I think for we were talking about the relevance of research and researching. I think also the value of supervision within that. I was so fortunate to have a very supportive supervisor who actually really helped me reflect much more deeply. And I needed to be aware of my own personal responses to disinhibition. Personal experience for me meant that I viewed disinhibition as something quite dangerous. I needed not to be disinhibited. So, I needed to be very careful that, that wasn't colouring what I was hearing from my participants. But obviously using a double hermeneutic, I'm in there with it. I'm making sense of what they're making sense of. So yes, I think the importance of good supervision. And I think also I think if anything else would come from this research is to really focus on on the counsellor's role and how they can actually then engage with the clients in a slightly different way, you know, exploring perhaps what's going on if the client turns the camera off or does another task, or how the client perhaps themselves views being disinhibited in other contexts.
Yeah, that sounds really valuable. So thank you. And finally, what's next for you? What are your plans? Yeah,
absolutely. There's so much more I'd love to explore with this. You know, I'm very interested on the client's perspective, not just, you know, do I share more? Do I not? Do I do this? But actually the meaning making process. So I think I'd like to perhaps look a bit more at the client's perspective, or be able to look at counsellor and client at the same time. There's lots of different avenues I think that I'd explore. And also having discussions all the time with other people. You know, something will come along that I'm sure that I'm going to go for, but I don't think it's finished yet. I think there's room for plenty more research and discovery here.
That sounds really exciting. Well, thank you. I think it's been an enlightening and valuable conversation that I think, you know, trained counsellors, our trainers, tutors and learners can all take something from. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you too. Thank you.